Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another casual stroll through Lord of the Rings Online. My name is Matt Elliott. I go by Scenario on the message boards, and we're here today for our final preview stream for the Legacy of Morgoth expansion pack. We just hit Bull Roarer with the first two regions, and we wanted to wrap up this series by going through the instances for for all of the regions. So with that in mind, we don't we get started. A reminder: this is a primarily world design focused stream, so we're going to be taking the look and feel. But we do have a special guest today. Our guest OnnMacMahal, one of our systems designers, is joining us to talk a little bit about what goes into making the instances, skills, rewards, and whatnot. So, welcome aboard. So,
Howdy, good
pardon
to be
me
here.
for any quick overlaps. All right. So we are ready to get going. So we've got this kind of nice view starting out here. So this expansion pack comes with three instances out of the box. We've got a three-person instance in Amberol. We have a six-person instance in Kudzagin and another six-person happening in Imular. And eventually we'll have the raid space being released post-launch, which will be taking place in Urush-Dar. So we wanted to just jump in. Like I said, normally this is a world design focused stream, but with OnnMacMahal here, we figured we would open the floor to talking about kind of broader topics of what our goals are for creating instances, if there are any just high level thematic goals that come with developing mechanics, as well as any themes associated with how we reward the players for completing the instances. So, with that in mind, and we do, just so people are aware, instances are not the only interiors that are going to be a part of this expansion pack. There are a handful of other, story-based instances as well as just dungeon interiors associated with the landscape that you'll be able to go into and explore. Not sure we'll be able to get to those today, but we did want to take a little bit of time to talk about the instances themselves. Um, so we'll start right up with the instances, the instance in Amberol, which is the salt mine. I can never remember the names of these spaces, so you'll pardon me if I don't say anything exactly right. But here we go.
I'd
So
pronounce
welcome
it
to
wrong if I
the
said the name.
Ashunug, the Fane of, let's see, mouse over, the Accursed.
The accursed.
Uh, so this is one of the instances that I did the world design for, and one of our newer designers did the instance design for. It's available on Bolero right now. So while I walk around inside it, is there anything in particular to this instance space that you're interested in talking about on that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things we're trying to do with each of these is tie them a little bit more, like instances in the past have, to some of the storylines in the areas. So we're really happy, or I've been really happy to get to work with both multiple world designers and multiple content designers on these spaces. The designers who are working on these instances are also working on like the quests in these regions. So hopefully, I know that players have been into this instance and into Amber Rule on beta, but hopefully, as you're playing through this organically on live, also it feels very much a part of the storyline of this zone.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I think we wanted to come back to was, having instance spaces dovetail into the storylines of the regions that we're building. When with the launch of the game, we had places like the Great Barrow and the Red Swamp that kind of acted as the capstone experience for a region before you're ready to move on. And I know that was something that Orion in particular was very excited to bring back to um, bring back to this expansion pack. It's always interesting building these spaces too because as a world designer, I have a very different sense of space compared to the designers that are working on them. It's a very difficult balance to like build a space that feels good to me visually, but is not too big or too small or too complex for what the instance designers want to do in these spaces.
Yeah, a lot of that first order instance feedback tends to be like, oh, if there's anything in the room, we'll find a way to get a boss caught on it and exploit the mechanics that way. So
Don't mind me
it's a
while I jump
constant
up on
struggle.
these crystals.
Yeah.
um, yeah, and I think instance spaces always end up being kind of a different beast when it comes to developing developing a release, because usually the world design team is the first team that's like boots on the ground when it comes to building out a landscape update. But with instance updates, we often really lean on the content team and the game systems team to be the first people thinking about and constructing the instances, at least from the paper design standpoint.
And I'm really excited about how these spaces thematically connect to some of the fights. I want to do my best to answer questions and sort of talk about some of this stuff without spoiling too many of these things. But partly that's just because for me it's been really cool to see these spaces come to life. I mean, for me being like completely on the other side of the fence compared to scenario, it's a lot of fun to have this paper concept of a list of skills and things that are related to this space, and then to actually get into it and see spooky hallways and this big scorpion altar and stuff. It's like it's very exciting for me to see it.
Well, and one of the things too that's interesting is usually when we're building landscape, we just kind of do our thing, and as we're building, we're working with our content folks and systems folks, saying like, oh, this is a cool place for this is a cool place for that. And for us it's a really different experience, because now like we're not the ones kind of spearheading the design and direction of the space, and often it's really up to us to find the spaces on the fringes of an encounter where we can add the character, as opposed to on landscape where it's like the character of the space is front and center right in the middle of everything.
And
Since this
especially
is
too,
live,
like
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, when we get to this point, like there's a lot that I can say about this instance because players have seen it too. But like when we get to this point, part of what's really both challenging and fun, I think, is that we get all of these different designers from different fields into the same space at the same time, and we're really working to make sure that this is like both thematically appropriate. It has the right look and feel. It has the right gameplay length. It has the right
Mm-hmm.
spaces that we need for different gameplay mechanics. For those of you who've gotten into that final boss room, like that room looks very different just on the surface compared to when you're in the instance running the encounter. And then the mechanics that we add into that space force you to interact with the space in a very different way. So there's a lot of both challenge and fun to be found in our various disciplines coming together at this point in the process where we can plug all the pieces in at once.
Yep. Since this is live on Bull Roar right now, I don't think we have to worry too much about spoilers. There may be some like key mechanics when it comes to boss encounters that we want to avoid. But is there anything that you found while working on this space with your content designer that you were partnered with, that you're really kind of interested and excited about talking about for this instance in particular?
I mean, the coolest thing about this space is the scorpions, and it's very exciting every time we get a new thing that we get to work with. And there are limitations to everything we do, but we were really excited to see how we could push the three-player instance here. So three-player instances are really challenging for us to design because we don't know, or we don't have the same sort of fixed understanding of what the player group composition is going to look like. So we get to this point where we have a strong sense of the theme of the space. I mean, Scenario's done an excellent job with this space. The scorpions all around, the mood lighting, the twisting, winding tunnels, and then we get to a point where we want to make sure that the encounters reflect some of that. So the feedback has been really good so far. I appreciate the feedback that we've gotten up to this point, but it's really exciting when we get to the point where we can sort of plug in, like we know that there's a cult here, we know that there are scorpions here. How are the cult members interacting with the scorpions? How are players interacting with both of those? How are you forced to backpedal when you
Mm-hmm.
you see an unexpected mechanic for the first time? When you get into this darkest part and you maybe start taking damage because the shadows are so deep down here.
Now, one of the things that with the content designer that was working on it, and usually the breakdown between content designer and a systems designer in these spaces is the content designer kind of handles the in space logic for what's going on, and it's your role as a systems designer to handle the mechanical logic of what the mobs in the space are doing, or what effects might be flying off of them at any moment to mess with the player, right?
Precisely, yeah.
And for me, like I'm just happy to be along for the ride, because often in spaces like this, while the look and feel is certainly important for selling the character of a space, what the space is often matters a bit less in comparison to what is happening in the space. So we try, like I said, we try to add in that theming on the sides. This instance space, for example, was an opportunity for me to play around with structures that we haven't really used much before when it comes to building a dungeon space, and trying to make a space that meets the goals of our content designer, meets the goal of OnMac when it comes to the actual space. So I'm coming up into the second boss encounter room, for example, and the space as I originally built it was going off of a map that the designers had passed on to me, and these rooms were much bigger than was originally expected, just because the way we as world designers perceive space is a little bit different than how other designers might see a space. So like we kind of took the map very literally and made these boss rooms match what we assumed to be the scale, and then that came back as a round of feedback. We're like, well, this is too big. We need to like shrink it down a little bit. Where are spots where we can shrink it down? And working with the content designer who was building the encounters, basically saying like, okay, you put down these like crate walls, for example, to kind of close off the areas that you want to close off, and then I'll come back in later, and if we need to spruce things up a little bit, we can do that. Um,
It's always a challenge in a boss room to make it feel like a real sort of lived-in space at the same time that it's like an appropriate
yeah,
mechanical space for a boss encounter. I'm sure many people in the chat right now know, you've played a game here or there where you get to a big boss arena and it's nothing. Because for us mechanically, we want a boss arena to be like a flat surface with nothing going on, but we're also
yeah.
trying to tell this whole story with it too, right? Like you've got mobs in here that are milling about that are, theoretically here doing things that are entirely outside of your story as the hero character. So
Yeah, that is certainly something that makes me as a world designer and artist a little sad, is when I'm told to make a 40 by 40 arena, but make it completely flat so that our pathing and effects don't do weird things. So that leads us to doing things like I've done here, where we have like these planks and whatnot embedded in the floor, and these debris piles. Other areas that we'll look at later, you leverage particle effects pretty heavily to just add visual noise to a space to make it look and feel cozier, more lived in, more busy than it physically actually is, in order to support the gameplay. Um, so I think we've taken a look at the salt mine pretty well. Before we bop off to the next one, I do want to take a look and see if there are any questions that we can answer here in chat. Um, so we'll see. So Old Benny asks, any theme with these instances similar to what Orion was saying that we all wanted to do, to feel like we were fighting other players, like within the depths of Magda Cordo? I don't think that was the intention, particularly with this space. We didn't. I don't think any of the encounters were really meant to feel like you were fighting, another burglar or another guardian or anything like that. But it did seem like an interesting approach and kind of a switch up from what players are used to.
yeah, we definitely weren't trying to do like another sort of mirrored fight, but we are making an effort also to make these fights feel both related to one another and different from one another. Like you want to feel a sense of continuity as you move through the space. When you're fighting cultists at the beginning, you start getting introduced to mechanics that you see that the boss cultists have, but you also
Mm-hmm.
start to see the scorpions that you see more and more as you go deeper into the space. So it's a challenge to make it. You don't want to feel like as a player that you're doing one boss fight and then that boss fight version 2 and then that boss fight version 3 as you move through. Like you want to feel like they're different, but also we're in this one continuous story.
Yep. So I just bopped over to the tombs of Nirgambar, and we'll run through that again. We'll run through that shortly. I just want to go through a couple more questions. Softsnake GR says his all-time question: uh, You make so much landscape in the world, and only for level 150. Why don't you make landscapes that have some live events or world bosses like warbands or roving threat-like bosses? I think we've kind of, and if aspects of the Veil of the Nine event and prior world landscape bosses have shown us is that doing big bold encounters like that on public landscape can be challenging both from a balance perspective because you have no control over how many people are going to show up to that fight. Like you could have a roving threat on landscape and it's just you and a buddy and you have no way of being able to beat it, or you have something like a ring wraith show up and you have the entire server descend on it, and that makes balancing those encounters really really hard, and why we tend to lean more towards instancing and more towards things like missions and skirmishes and whatnot to have those kind of signature experiences. Not to say that we won't do those things in the future, but it does present a design and balance challenge when those things are put on public landscape. All right, we have someone saying it kind of reminds me of ancient Egypt. Certainly, some themes kind of similar to those regions can be found throughout everything we're doing in this area. We have a question from Drew, or a comment from Druid's Fire saying, "We need those crawling scorpions as house deco. Imagine the spooky themed houses with that." Decals are actually something that are kind of hard to do as deco items because they kind of project and bake themselves onto the surface that they're on. So there may be a static version of that we could produce sometime, but sadly it is not going to be available for the launch of things. Druid's Fire also asks, was the content designer for the instance the same as the one who did the heavy lifting for the zone as a whole? No, it was actually two separate people. Usually when we come to a space like this and start working on our landscape plan and our instance plan, people can kind of decide what they want to work on. And the person who was doing the lion's share of the content work for Amberol opted to just do the content work for Amberol, and one of our other designers who is very interested in instances decided to take up the instance for the region. Let's see, go through.
Last one's for you, Scenery. Any housing items coming from these instances?
Any housing items coming from these from Old Benny?
What
Those
I
big
guess I
standing
just for the
torches. Yeah, there are a few. There are certainly a ton of housing items coming with this update. I think I've produced about 200 of them based off of all the deco items and objects that we had created, that the art team created for us for this update. And we had a meeting, what was it, last week before, where we kind of like looked through all of it and earmarked what reward vectors all of those would have. So there are definitely a lot of heavy themes from this region in the housing rewards. The big torches, not so much, but a lot of structural stuff, a lot of flora. So there's a lot. It's all on Bull Roar right now. You can find, if you go to Trotter in the Isengard Tavern, you can start taking a look at the housing stuff. And I know Yao Deco de Milieu already has a preview up for those items too.
there was also a question about balance. I just
Yep.
to clarify, this is the first Bull Roar that the Amberol 3-player instance has been up, so there are definitely a few things that need to be tuned about that instance. Boss 2 in particular is there's more outgoing damage than there should be from those bosses.
Yeah, that's one of the fun things about Bull Roar is it's a beta environment, or sometimes depending on where we're at, it can even be an alpha environment, and so we we hope for things to be working perfectly, but we expect to get bugs. um, So for those of you that are wondering too, as I'm walking around these spaces, you're noticing there's no monsters, there's no fighting going on. I'm in the instance 0 version of these. This is the empty version, just so that we can walk around and take a look at the space unimpeded. We're in the tombs of Nirgumbar right now. I think this is the next instance that we are planning to have available on Bullroar, but I'm not exactly certain of that. I'm not sure what our schedule and timing is for all of these. But this is our Kudzagin instance. Um, Again, it's showcasing um, a lot of the new structures that we have from the Shigana asset set. These kind of big, imposing colonnades and whatnot. And I am super thrilled with these assets and to be working with them. And they make nice
It's
square,
really
flat
excellent.
instance spaces for you.
One of the things that's been really cool to see with the world team put together for these spaces and the artists who are making these assets is, this is called the Legacy of Morgoth, the expansion. And so a lot of these spaces are, to the point of the person who mentioned that it feels sort of Egyptian, like a lot of these are meant to feel very old, very, very old. And I know that that can feel kind of like a lot of other things in a lot of games try to do, this is old, but, conveying a sense of age and imperiality about these spaces can be hard. And I think what the team has done with these is really, really magnificent.
Don't mind me as I admin hack my way through a door. I was watching a streamer yesterday, and he was really, really wanting to have, run around in Kudzagin in stormy weather. And he's like, "Hey, if Dev's watching this, can you log into Bullroar and make it stormy for me?" Um, I don't think we have those kinds of effects going on in the dungeons, but who knows? The artists always surprise us with fun things when it comes to the boss effects.
Yeah, there are definitely some fun surprises that have been built into this space.
So this is a space I didn't build. One of our other world designers built it. So I'm just, excuse me, just kind of wandering around in here. We're taking a look at things. You can actually see up here there is a little piece of logic that hasn't been layered off. Remote detector. That's our way for us to let monsters know when when you're in an area. And ignore the Z fighting.
Minor bugs.
Yeah, well, depends on the audience. I know there are. I think there was a time where on the old forums we had one person who was very diligently finding every single intersecting object, Z fighting thing, and reporting it in a thread. And I think we still have, bugs in our world queue that we haven't gotten to yet, just because of how thorough that player was going through everything.
Z Fighting 2 is one of those like bizarre, technologically only it can only exist in virtual space because you can only
Yeah.
have Z Fighting if it's mathematically identical in position. In the real world, you might be one atom off from the other. You wouldn't have Z Fighting, but
Yeah. Well, and it all comes down to just the engine just fighting over, or the objects rather, not even necessarily the engine, but the objects fighting over basically who gets to be seen first.
yeah.
I feel like it's both of them going Marsha, 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 and neither of them winning that argument.
I love these tunnels though. I am personally a fan of the deep dark spaces in Lotro. And one of my favorite things about seeing these instant spaces for the first time is just how much spookier they get as you descend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's. There we go. So you can no longer see our death pancake. That way leads to death. And I don't think I went through all of the instance. I think this is just one like kind of wing of it, from my understanding. But it's
Yeah, I'm not
certainly
certain.
an
I saw a
imposing room to
question.
walk into.
There was a question in chat about whether or not the space is non-linear. My understanding is that the space is more or less linear, but like many of the spaces in the game, it's meant to imply more nonlinearity than exists.
I think that's one of the great tricks that a level designer always keeps in their pocket when they're building a space like this is, you get kind of your map from your design partners, and you kind of look at it and you're like a little sad because you're like, oh well, I had all of these other great ideas for this space, but none of them really fit within the linear path that the designer might want for the space. So then it's up to us to like put little pockets in places here and there that aren't accessible. Things like this up here where you've got this sarcophagus up high that's in an inaccessible area, but it helps the world designer, the artists, tell the story of the space in a way that doesn't impact the gameplay of the space. Let's speed up my movement a little bit. All right. Any other questions? I know there were some questions about class stuff. We're not really going to be focusing on that in this stream. However, Orion is subbing in for Cordovan for next week's Court of the Ring. So or this week's Court of the Ring, sorry. So I would highly recommend that if you have questions for things that we're not covering in this stream, that you jump into that stream Friday at noon Eastern Time, so that you can ask those questions there.
And you
So
can
yeah,
pepper
so
me
for
with all the
example,
class
this room.
comments.
Sorry, what?
I was just gonna say I'm not gonna answer those questions. You can ask them right now. I'm just not gonna answer them right now.
Yeah. So as I was saying about like little side rooms and whatnot, and the door that I just deleted, my assumption would be that this door will open up as part of gameplay, but often we'll have little side hallways like this that are just closed off that you can see beyond into without getting access to. And sometimes that does inspire the designers who are working in the space to do something with them. They'll swap out the static door that we put in with something that is openable and can be used for gameplay purposes. So I don't think there's anything down there. One of the things I love about this space too is just like how high up the ceilings go and how it kind of makes you feel tiny inside of it. What was Morgoth getting up to with all of these grand temples and tombs?
Certainly no good to be found with the dead here.
All right. Well, I think we've gotten a good sense of the look and feel of this space. How about we bop on over to the next one? Next one is the Wells of Forgetting, and I'm not sure the actual development name or the actual final name for that, but it will tell us when we go into it. You see the loading screen here, and Breland Unexplored. This is part of our like development process. All land blocks, all locations in the game start out as an unexplored territory, and then over time, as we work in them, we assign appropriate information to them. So right now, this is unexplored territory, but will eventually be assigned the proper area designations so that you're in those locations. The designer for this space really wanted at least portions of it to feel like you were wandering around within an ancient Shigani city. And I think the world designer that built that really pulled this off pretty well. I know originally the world designer that made this was really hoping to build it on landscape just because it would make some aspects of the work being done here much simpler. Like, things like the ground texture here would allow us, if we were on landscape, to paint it however we need to paint it in order to make it, look good. But there's certainly benefits to building in a dungeon interior like this, particularly when it comes to just keeping a space simple. But again, this is another just like it feels cool and imposing where you're walking in here and there are these tall structures. I know this instance in particular was one where there was a lot of kind of rich conversation about what the designer of the space wanted to do with some of the boss encounters. And I think they're certainly going to be reminiscent of one of our Gundabad experiences as well. Without avoiding, or while avoiding the spoiler stuff, was there anything with this space in particular that you were like really excited about with the ideas from the designer?
I haven't actually seen this space since it was basically white boxed, so I'm kind of just enjoying this ride, seeing it, much more polished with the various deco. I'm really excited about a couple of the mechanics in this space. The boss fights in here, um, we had some concerns early on that they might have been a little bit too involved for the time that we had available to us, but I think we've got things pretty well in and hooked up at this point. So I'm really excited to see players experience this. This is one of these like there's a really interesting story found in this space, and we're doing our best to convey that story through the mechanics of the bosses and how players are interacting with the bosses and the boss environments.
Yeah, this space is one core dungeon with a handful of interesting supporting spaces that you'll go into as part of the mechanics in the space. I'm not going to go to those little portions because again, much like on Mac, I want to not spoil things. Once this is available on Bull Roar, certainly the cat will be out of the bag. But for the time being, I think this space serves really well as just kind of an interesting statement on just the different approaches that designers can take using the same kinds of assets, right? Like we went from the tombs of Nirgambar, which were these big, imposing tomb structures, to building a city basically using the same assets. And that really speaks to just like the flexibility that our artists provide us with the assets that they give us. You gotta
Yeah,
watch
even
out for
simple
those
things like
sparks.
changing the colors of the lights in these rooms and some of the other decoration around them makes them feel very, very different. It's
Yep.
wild.
So Old Benny asks, is there a good amount of exploration and/or Slayer deeds for these instances? Has there been? I've been fairly divorced from the deed planning for the instance spaces. Usually, I'm pretty on top of them for the landscape. But I know deeds are a big part of kind of the advancement path through instances. Um, do you know much about what the deed plans are for all of these instance
Yeah,
spaces?
I would expect the normal amount. One of the sort of stretch goals that we have penciled in is that we would always love to have more interesting deeds, especially in instance spaces. The challenge is that a lot of times, even something that is simple to understand, simple on paper, it can be very, very complicated to set that up in a space. So if it's just for a deed that's kind of for flavor, that tends to be, one of the first things that gets cut when we get into crunch time and we just don't have the bandwidth to do that sort of flavorful stuff. So I would expect the normal deeds. They've got, standard instance deeds, meta deed, the things that you're used to that are kind of the usual. But I wouldn't expect too much on top of that.
So Mario Justum asks, while designing instances, do you have to be much more conscious about the amount of unique assets, textures, etc. for performance reasons versus landscape? Is it a big consideration or not much different from landscape? I think there are very different considerations. From the world perspective, lighting takes a much greater effort for us in dungeon spaces because they're generally tighter spaces. We need to make sure there's good visibility all around. And just having like a single light in a space doesn't do a good enough job of portraying the character of the space. So lighting is often something that like we'll do our first pass on it and then we'll check our light influence counts and we're like, "Oh, this thing has 15 lights on it. That's going to make for an angry asset and we have to fix that." I think in dungeon spaces we do get some benefits from better performance in terms of visibility culling, as well as just the amount of stuff that is loaded in general is less when you're in a dungeon space than when you're on landscape. When you're in dungeon space, The only land block that space cares about is the one you're in. When you're on landscape, you have to load all of the stuff in the surrounding loaded land blocks, as well as anything that might be in far view, all of the sky data, like all of that stuff. So there's a much smaller set of assets that you have to worry about. I think in instance spaces, and OnMac and I were talking a little bit about this before going on camera. Instance spaces, sometimes I think it can be a little bit easier to accidentally create mechanics and effects and whatnot that can be unperformant in like an instance than on landscape, just because our ambitions on landscape are not as intense as they are in an instance space. So I think we lean more towards trying to be careful about the mechanical performance in dungeon spaces than we are about the fidelity, the art performance.
Yeah, every game is different. Every game engine is different. And, at the end of the day, this is binary running on your computer at a certain level. So it might be easy to say I was having this conversation with a designer in this space even a couple of weeks ago. There was a mechanic that we had talked about that was pretty straightforward. But when I got to the point where I was actually implementing these skills and mechanics, I realized, oh, totally skipped over the fact that the detection was a negative. And like detecting a absence of something is one of those things that for us as humans is conceptually very simple, but for a program can often be extremely complicated because the computer just doesn't have, whatever your code that you're running is just doesn't necessarily know the way that your brain does if something is not there. Detecting the absence of something is just one of those weird things that, like, if you're not careful, it can be extremely non-performant. So, in this circumstance, in that instance, we just work around it and we kind of don't detect a negative. But that's the kind of thing that, like, man, it can rise up out of nowhere.
How often are you trying to find something that isn't there? All the time? Oh, yeah, maybe not that.
Yeah. Yeah, like maybe every frame two monsters need to always know if there's nothing within 40 meters of them. That's actually extremely bad. We should not do that.
Mm-hmm. Liquor Rock says, "This looks awesome. Will this instance have some vendors like in the Isle of Storms?" So I think for context for people that are unfamiliar, there is a kind of small section at the very beginning of the Isle of Storms where you can find standard vendors, supplier, provisioner, healer, I believe, are there, and that was kind of added in as sort of a convenience feature, just in case like you were having a hard time with the challenge modes and you just kept wiping and wiping and wiping, and it would allow you to do the repairs that you need to do to your gear, purchase if there were potions pots that you needed to like dispel effects and whatnot. Those were there to kind of help support that. I'm not sure if we have plans for those for any of these spaces, or even if those things kind of fit thematically in some of these spaces. I think with the Isle of Storms, it kind of fit thematically. It's like, oh well, you're not the only shipwrecked mariners that came across this island and are trapped in an adventure. Whereas something like the Tombs of Nirgambar, um, or the Wells of Forgetting, like those might not thematically make sense to go there. Not saying they won't go in there, or not saying there's not going to be an enemy with a profession title that is healer that's just going to run up and punch you in the face. Um, but yeah, I'm not certain if something like that is appropriate for any of these spaces. However, the space that I just dropped into probably makes sense for something like that. So we're in the entryway into the raid space, Utug Bur. This space is not becoming available as part of the expansion pack. Um, and this space kind of represents all of our instance designers and systems designers working on instances kind of coming together to all work together on the raid encounter. So it's split up over three different distinct experiences with each person, each designer taking one of them, and then OnMac getting to support all of them as well. Um, and this is kind of representing the culmination of um, the instance arcs basically for the expansion pack, and fits in after the main story of the expansion pack has been told. That's always a tricky thing for us to do because, like, we have Maid of Lions, who is, really wanting to tell an awesome story, but also wanting to use the same spaces that we want to have awesome instances in. And so it's always kind of tricky to negotiate who gets to work what and where and what state things are going to be in when we get into them. Um, and so not only will you kind of be in some of these spaces as part of the raid, but you'll be in some parts of them as part of the Song of Waves of Wind storyline as well. And I think that's one of the things that I found really compelling about the idea is allowing players to kind of see places that they've gone in multiple states, throughout the game or throughout their gameplay. I do this in the Citadel of Winds as well. There's a couple of instances that take place in the Citadel of Winds, and for me, it was really important to set them in different parts of the Citadel, but in a way that felt familiar. Like, oh, I can look over this balcony and I can see where prior instances that I've done in this space have taken place. So I'm hoping to try to achieve some of that here in Utugbur. We are not going through the main entrance into Utugbur right now. This is a little side entrance to get us in there. One of the things I really enjoy about the new rock assets that we've gotten over the years is it really helps us build these more organic looking cave spaces than I think we've been able to build before in the past. And it's really nice to just be able to build those kind of just natural feeling cavey spaces without just having to rely on the raw cell meshes for things, which show their age nowadays. So we are here. This is I0 version. This is where we call this the raid lobby, basically. You'll be able to get entrance to all of the different wings of the raid here. And this is generally just a decent gathering place for people that are getting ready to go into the raids. There are going to be 3 entrances here. Those that use so if you want to participate in gathering groups here, you can. All of our instances will also be available through the instance finder. Excuse me. So you don't need to worry about actually being in the physical space. I'm not sure if we are planning for any sort of discovery unlocks. Do you know if that's
I
something
think
that
we
was
do. I
planned?
think we are.
So you have to
I'm
come here at least
relatively
once.
because that was part of when we talked about these tying into these other storylines. Like we do want players to understand that these are these are spaces in these regions that are related to some of the other things going on.
Let's see. So Fervogor has a question. Are there any plans you can share about the loot that will drop in these instances?
There will be loot. It will be dropping from the instances. I, I'll be hitting basically all of your equipment slots from one or another place. There's not a lot more that I can say beyond that, other than loot is one of those weird things. Like it's it motivates you to play these, but it's also not often the most exciting thing. So for me, the goal with loot is to have a good enough distribution that a lot of players feel like when you run these instances, you're getting things that are worthwhile and that you want to run all of these instances. So that's pretty much my goal with the itemization here.
And I can always make you more housing items. If you need more, I can make you more housing items.
There
Let's
was a
see.
question just now about the raid being organized. So this is split up into wings, and partly that's I mean it's for a couple of reasons. One is for us, and one is for you. So
Mhm.
having locks that let you skip bosses to get to a later boss in a raid, those are one of those things that are conceptually very simple to understand, but technically extremely complicated to set up in the space itself. logically. So splitting it up into wings eases a lot of that pressure on us. So if you as players want to say, we want to go do this part of the raid, it's just its own wing, as opposed to having some convoluted weekly lock quest structure set up for it.
And it definitely makes it easier for me to build it and for the individual designers to work in it if we all don't have to fight over working in the same space. I think that's something that has been challenging in the past when we've had these more collaborative instance spaces where more than one instance designer is working on them is you really, on those spaces you really had to kind of like barter with your coworkers for time in those spaces. And when you're especially when you're in a development cycle like we're in right now where everyone's just kind of like working fast to get things done, that little like pause of can I work in this today, oh no I have to wait until tomorrow to work on this, can actually really slow down the implementation process for a lot of things. It slows down iteration, it slows down ability to even just get stuff in. um, so building these out as wings, it gives each designer a space that they can work in without having to worry about interrupting the work of other players or other people. And honestly, it gives the players a little bit of like breathing room too, so they don't feel like they have to just like keep going and keep going and keep going. I think with the a lot of players and developers too have fond memories of places like Carndoom and Uragarth, the Red Swamp. But the way those were originally set up, like those could easily be 4 to 6 hour sessions because you had to just keep going. And I don't think that's really that kind of mentality isn't really respectful of players nowadays.
Yeah, the expectation is not that everyone entering here will be doing a 8 to 10 hour dedicated raid night, because we mostly just can't.
I love this hallway. This feels so good to me. But yeah, I think like you know we as designers have matured over the years, and when MMOs were kind of more of a fledgling experience, the idea of dedicating that much time to a single space in a playthrough was kind of like new and exciting and kind of appealing. But now we're all adults, or at least called adults, and we don't have that time. We as players ourselves just don't have that time because life. So having something set up in this way is just makes it more convenient for everyone to have life in addition to having game.
Yeah, it's a really difficult balance to walk, especially too. I mean, I'm doing my best to make sure that, like we were talking about the itemization earlier, that you don't feel squeezed by that, but you do feel like there are things that you want to reach for, because ultimately, like, what we want out of these spaces is for you to enjoy playing in them and for you to want to play in them as much as possible, because it's fun, but it should be fun. There was also a question about the raid wings and how they connect to one another. There will be sort of a sense of continuity through the wings. Like, internally we call them 1, 2, 3.
Right.
So we're trying to maintain that sort of story moving into these spaces too. And this will connect to the songs of Wave and Wind. And there are a lot of things that we can't talk about right now because it's it's just strictly connected to those narratives and some of those characters. But it's really exciting the way that this is shaping up.
Let's see. So Renee Killer asks, how many bosses will the raid have?
I think it's safe to say 6. It's, obviously, the raid is not finished right now. The raid is not on Bullroar, not imminently releasing. So
I mean,
I
my
say
part of
that,
it's done. I'm all
with
done.
an sure, it looks great. I mean, we're seeing it right now. I just want to, I'll put an asterisk there, but six is the target. So we're looking at three wings that are each two boss.
All right, and we're in here in the final space. So there's also, we're working with assets. When we build spaces like this, we often work with the assets that we have. So, for example, directly in front of me, this is a placeholder asset, which is going to be getting some unique art. We've already seen it from the artists. And that will anchor, the back of the room and kind of act as the focal point for the space. One of the things that is really nice about working with a project that has such a volume of assets is while we may not always have the exact assets we need, we often have close enough assets, like the Fane to Sauron here. We often have close enough assets that we can use to sub in to kind of evoke the look and feel of what we're going for, and then we'll work with our artists to be like, this is the space that this thing goes. Here are the dimensions for it. Here's what it's supposed to look like. Um, do your awesome thing, artists, and make something cool and creepy and spectacular to go here. And I think the artist that was working on it nailed the cool and creepy and spectacular and kind of. I think the artist was like looking up Escher and non-Euclidean artwork when it came to coming up with the focal piece for this room, and he was having a blast doing it. All right. Let's see if the so does the final boss have his own wing from Perks of 115? That's kind of where we're at right now. This interior space is intended for the final boss of the instance, the raid set. So this is where you'll have those encounters. We're not gonna speak specifically to who those bosses are or what those bosses are right now, just because we don't want to spoil anything. Because there's a lot of story tied into these, as OnMac had mentioned. So it's better safe than sorry on that front. Uh, all right, so we've got a few minutes left. Is there anything else on Mac that you wanted to talk about in regards to these instances, or any spaces that you're excited about for the expansion pack that I haven't gone into yet? I think I covered all of the instance spaces, but I know there are a lot of interiors. So is there anything that you would like to say to kind of wrap up the instance talk for
I,
this
I can say
stream?
as far as the instances go, I know a lot of players were a little disappointed with the mechanics of the Umbar instances, and I will say that was largely a function of me basically doing a lot of that work on my own. And other members of the team have talked about Umbar before, but I'm really, really excited about these upcoming instances because it's been such a joy to work with both the world team and the other content designers to make some of these encounters really sing. Like some of the stuff that you've seen in the Amberol final boss fight, like that's stuff that I can't do. I simply do not have the knowledge, expertise, training to do those things. So it's really exciting for me when I can sort of work my magic on the skill side and doing some stuff with the enemy AI, and then match that up with these beautiful environments that World has put together and some of these like more interesting, for lack of a better word, mechanics that are only possible when you've got a content designer who has the time to sit down and make some of these fights more interesting.
Old Benny asks what your favorite boss to work on has been for this cluster.
uh it involves water, but I'm going to hold it close to my chest right now.
Fair enough. Fair enough. There was a question from Grodin that says, "Will Adso ever finish building his inn? Poor Hobbit has been working on it for 17 years." One of the things when we did King's Gondor that I really lobbied for was to have Adso make his way down to help with the restoration of Gondor. Adso and Thornley, both of them, I wanted them to come down and help out with that, purely for the comedy of it would delay them both more back at home. um, Little Redhead says, "Further adventures of Adso, please." Um, I know there was some talk about doing more further adventures stuff. I think we were hoping to do some this year, but those kind of fell off our plate because of other priorities. I know further adventures give particularly our content designers an opportunity to kind of dive into stories of characters that they're excited about delving into more, and I think they're great opportunities for that. So whenever those opportunities come up, I know, much like for me, whenever I have the chance to build a fill in the gaps region, I jump on it with gusto. Um, the the content designers, a number of them, really like chomping at the bit to do more further adventures content when they have the time to do it. Um, Edith Eldora says, "More Tales of Yore, too, please." The tricky thing with Tales of Yore is, unlike a further adventure, which can be just a series of instances. Well, I shouldn't say just a series of instances because there's a lot of work that's associated with them. Um, Building a series of story instances like that is a much smaller effort and requires fewer people than building a whole new region, whether it's whole cloth new region or Tales of Yore. Um, and so those, we really have to be intentional about where they fit into our schedule and have to have a good reason to bring them in, to make them.
We've got such a giant whiteboard. I mean, like all of us as individual designers have basically whiteboards of lists of things that we would love to do. All of us feel squeezed by time, in part just
Mm-hmm.
because we like working in this world. And if we had limitless time, there are so many things that we would love to do.
Definitely. I've got my punch list that I'm slowly working through. But things like, the necessary evils of like revamping Moria stable routes, for example. That's gonna take up some time. But luckily, once we hit the launch of the expansion pack, there's a gap of time, usually during the holiday season, where we're all kind of taking a breather, winding down, enjoying our holidays, but also having a little bit of room to kind of tackle those side projects that we're interested in. So who knows what surprises next year will bring because of that. But um,
It's dangerous. You find yourself relaxing, and then suddenly you're just having ideas, and you know that it's
yep,
bad to have those ideas because you don't have the time for them. But
I've been playing on Angmar, and it's always hard to play the game because I keep seeing bugs. I'm working on wrapping up Even Dim right now, and I'm like, that's a bug, and that's a bug, and that's a bug, and that's a bug, and so
uh,
we're never wanting for things to do. But anyways, we have hit 3 o'clock, so I think it's time for us to wrap up. Thank you, Ongmak, for joining us and for talking about instances, and thank you all for dropping in and asking questions about the instances. We're really excited about the expansion pack coming up. Should be hitting Bull Roar 2 hopefully next week. And we'll just probably keep on bull roaring until we get close enough to launch day to not really need it anymore. Um, but yeah, if you're interested at all in getting a preview for what's going on with the Legacy of Morgoth expansion pack, feel free to update the Bull Roar client and jump on in. You can create a new character there, or you can transfer over one of your live characters onto it. And pay attention to the message boards and social media to find out what's coming up. Like I said, on Friday, Orion is going to be subbing in for Cordovan on Court of the Rings. Well, I think it's now going to be his show, Orion's show for the day. So if you have questions for Orion, questions that we weren't able to answer today, feel free to stop in there and ask them there. So, any parting words you'd like to have on Mac?
no, I mean, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this upcoming expansion.
Yeah, I am too. So Thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a great afternoon, and we'll see you in Middle Earth.